Good morning. I was wondering how you're enjoying winter because around here it's not very cold yet and we don't have very much snow. And so I don't know how long that's going to last, but I'm actually enjoying it quite a bit. We'll see what happens. The other thing I was wondering is whether or not you guys like tests. How do you get ready for a test? I think listening to your teacher is probably the best place to start. Did you know that God gives us tests too? Sometimes they're big tests, and sometimes they're small tests like a little quiz. But today we are going to see Abraham facing the biggest test of his life. And our story today is called God Tests Abraham. Now, quite a bit of time has passed since our story last week because Isaac is now about 18 years old. Abraham loves Isaac. This is his beloved son. He's the son that God promised him and that he has waited for 25 years. Abraham and Sarah, they have grown in their faith and their love for God. And we have seen God test Abraham. And some of those tests he's passed and some he's failed. But the Bible tells us that even if we're unfaithful, he remains faithful. Now one day, God said to Abraham, "Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son whom you love, and I want you to take him up to Mount Moriah and offer him up as a burnt sacrifice to me." Well, that's an extremely hard test. It didn't make any sense because everything that God had promised was to come through Isaac. So, did Abraham have enough faith and love in God to do this? It must have seemed confusing that God would ask him to do this kind of a thing. But Abraham did not argue with God. He didn't cry, collapse, have a tantrum. The Bible tells us that he got up very early the next morning. He took 2 servants and he took Isaac and he set out. So let's just see where they were. They were living down here in Beersheba, and God wanted Abraham to take Isaac up here to Mount Moriah, and there he wanted him to sacrifice him. So Abraham did not tell Sarah what he was about to do because she would have stopped him. And he didn't tell the servants, and he didn't tell Isaac. This was a special test for Abraham alone. Now they set out for Mount Moriah. It took 3 days to get there. Now when they got there, when Abraham could see the place from far off, he said to the servants, "Now you stay here with the donkey, and Isaac and I are going to go up there, and you wait for us until we worship the Lord and until we both come back to you." Now, does that sound a bit strange? Because Isaac is supposed to go up there and offer up Isaac as a sacrifice. So why did he say, "Wait until we both come back"? Well, we find the answer to that in the book of Hebrews, because it says in Hebrews that Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. So that means Abraham was thinking if he offered up Isaac on the mountain, God would raise him up from the dead right there on the mountain. He believed God had the power to do that. Abraham is showing great faith. Well, they left the servants behind and they kept climbing up the mountain. Offering sacrifices was a way of life for them. So Isaac was very familiar with this. But as they were walking along, Isaac said, "Dad, you have the fire and you have the knife and I'm carrying the wood, but where's the sacrifice? Where's the lamb?" And Abraham said to Isaac, "God will provide for himself a lamb." Abraham is showing great faith again. Now, when they got to the top of the mountain, they had to build an altar. And Abraham, we don't know what the conversation was between Abraham and Isaac. It was a private one, so we don't know what they talked about, what was said. But Abraham bound Isaac and laid him on the altar. Isaac didn't struggle. He didn't try to run away. And that shows us that Isaac believed God and trusted God and his father as well. So he's on there on the altar, and Abraham raises his knife about to kill Isaac, when a voice from heaven said, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham said, I'm here. And God said, do not touch the boy. Do not lay a hand on him, because now I know that you love me and you fear me, you respect me, and you will give up the thing that you love most for me. And then Abraham heard something in the thicket, and he turned around, and there was a ram that was caught in the thicket. God had provided. Abraham knew. Do you remember what Abraham said to Isaac? God will provide for himself a lamb. There was a ram in the thicket. And so Abraham took the ram and he laid it on the altar, and they worshiped God. And then the angel of the Lord called from heaven again and said, Abraham, because you have done this, and not withheld your son from me, I will surely bless you. Do you remember what those promises were that God made to Abraham? Let's look at them again. He said to Abraham, I am going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Wow, look how many stars there are. He was going to have that many descendants. And he said, I'll make your descendants as numerous as the sand on the sea, all the grains of sand. He also said, you and your descendants will possess the cities of your enemies. The land is going to be yours. You know, from Abraham's line, and he had said to Abraham, you know, all of the nations of the world will be blessed through you. And that means that through Abraham's family line would one day come Jesus. And Jesus would be the substitute, the sacrifice for us, for our sins. Because when Jesus died on the cross, he was the sacrifice. He was paying the price that we deserve to pay for our sin. And so Jesus is our substitute. He is our perfect substitute. Just like the ram was the substitute for Isaac. Only Jesus is the perfect one now. Now, after Abraham and Isaac returned to the servants, they went back to Beersheba, and they lived there until Sarah died. And Sarah died when she was 127 years old. I mean, isn't that amazing? 127. And you know, Sarah is the only woman in the Old Testament whose age we're told when she died. You know, Sarah was the mother of the promised son to Abraham, and so she has a very important place in Israel's history. And Sarah had also learned to love and trust God more fully in her life too. Now, when Sarah died, Abraham realized he didn't have a place to bury her because he didn't own any of the land yet. And so he went to the Hittites who lived in that land. This is the land that God promised Abraham. And he said to the Hittites, listen, could you help me buy a piece of land so that I can bury my wife Sarah? Well, you know, the Hittites, they really honored Abraham. And in fact, they called him a mighty prince of God. And they so respected them, and they said, you can have any of our tombs. Our very best tombs are yours. Well, these are some actual ruins of Hittite tombs. Now, these are the ruins. So in those days, they would have been really spectacular tombs. And you can see at the front, they have carved some of the gods that they worshipped at the front of their tombs. But you know, Abraham worshipped the one true God, and he didn't want to bury Sarah in their tombs. And so he said, listen, there's a field, you know, it's just east of Mamre, and I would like to buy that field, and I would like you to help me buy it. And there was a man there called Ephron, and he said, well, that field is worth about 400 shekels. But what's 400 shekels between friends? You can just have it. And Abraham said, no, I insist on paying for it. So Abraham weighed out in front of everybody 400 shekels for that piece of field that was east of Mamre. So where is that? So here's Beersheba, where they're living again. And Mamre is right here. And they used to live in Mamre. So Abraham's very familiar with that land, and this is the field that he wants to buy. And so that field to the east of Mamre became Abraham's. That was the first piece of the promised land that he owned. And in that field, there was a cave. And, they didn't have cemeteries like we do today, and often they buried people in caves. And so this cave here, it would be big enough to hold several people. And so this is where he buried Sarah, and it became Abraham's burial cave for his family. And so even himself and other members of his family were eventually buried there. So even after all these years, Abraham's now about, 140. After all these years, he still didn't own any of the land except for this little piece, and he still only had one son. But we can see that God has kept and still keeps all of his promises to you and to me too. All right, see you next time.